Understanding and defeating racism. In order to address racism effectively and to defeat it, the first thing we have to do is understand it. And I want to begin by alerting you to the fact that racism is very old. And when I say racism, I want to include racial prejudice, class prejudice, and so on. So I'm using a kind of a broad term. The thing about racism is that it also happens everywhere. It's not exclusive to one part of the world. So you don't say there's racism in Europe and America, but there's no racism in Asia, there's no racism in Africa. Racism is everywhere, and it's been with us for a long time. So let's get into a little bit about understanding racism. Racism actually happens in every culture. So I want to begin with some historical examples. For example, and this is in random order, it's not sequential. But let's take, for example, the Jews. Not the Jews, the German. Let's take, for example, the Germans. Led by Hitler, the German white population espoused an ideology that they were superior to other races, and especially Jews. In fact, it was called, they came up with a terminology to describe the exclusive German strain, and they call it the Aryan race. Of course, this conjecture was soundly debunked, even as he tried to promulgate it. So for example, he said that the athletes were faster and they were stronger, and the white race was pure, and so on. And some of you may remember this, that in the Olympics in 1932, I believe it was, Jesse Owens, a black American, obliterated that theory. But yet, these theories persist. Of course, they have no base in logic. It's simply an ideology, a bad ideology that has gone wrong and that has been permeated and persisted over the years. Another example of racism is South Africa. So the Dutch and the British primarily proclaimed superiority over Africans and Indians and dark-skinned people. Of course, this was again something that was easily debunked, but when an ideology takes off, sometimes it's hard to rein it in when the persons who are promulgating it, they have made it the dictum of their society, and people start to buy into it. Another example of this is that the British and what we call Americans proclaim superiority over black Africans. But I want to give you a little history of America so that we can understand that America is not what we think America is. What is America? America, the original inhabitants of America were what we call Native Americans or Indians, or Native Indians. Now, these the native population never gave the country over to the British colonizers who came here, who we call the founding fathers of America. In fact, the British who landed in America were never invited, and they weren't given permission, but they arrived in a country already populated, and in fact, what we call the United States of America had Cherokee and Seminole and other Indian nations or collectives all over. In fact, there's a map. I went to the Native American Museum, and I saw a map of what we call the 52 states of America. And some people don't realize is that many of the names that we use for cities and states are actually Indian or Native American in origin. And so that's another example of, in this case, white British persons coming to a land that didn't belong to them, taking it over and telling the native inhabitants that they were inferior, and eventually negotiating contracts to the point where the land now belongs to the descendants of the British who took over America. So if you look at it technically right now, America is still not one nation. And if you travel around America, it's very evident. I remember I went to school in Oklahoma, and in Oklahoma, they have Oklahoman tribes, and in Texas they have tribes, in Florida you have the Seminole tribe, and many of these tribes, they have their own land that belongs to them in America. They call it reservations, but if you listen to the Indians, they said this is the Seminole Nation. In other words, they never relinquished who they were to the British who came along. They were simply driven out, or they negotiated bad contracts, and they ended up losing their land. However, to compensate the Native Americans for some of the atrocities that happened, the British, who we now call the Americans, or the primarily white Americans, the British who gained independence from Britain, because America started out as a British colony, the British negotiated with Native Indians and said, okay, we will, in exchange for peace, we will give you these parcels of lands, and they call them reservations and Indian towns and whatever. In fact, if you go to places like Florida, wherever you go, you would see evidence of the fact that America is still not one nation. So you have the Seminole Nation in Florida, and you go in Florida, you go in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and federally gambling was illegal, but it's not illegal on the Seminole owned property, because the Seminole property is actually sovereign in to some extent. So it has its own laws and so on. And there's a complicated kind of, I guess what you can call it, complicated protocol between the Indian nation and the federal government. So the federal government does not police Indian territories to a certain extent. There are certain federal laws that override everything, but there are also certain provisions where the federal government doesn't interfere in whatever the Indian reservation, the Indian owned property decides to do. That's why Indians all over America, or what we call Indians, can have casinos in areas where casino gambling is illegal. Many Americans don't even realize that. I talk to so many Americans, and they don't realize that America, or what we call America, is still not one nation. It's one nation, but it's very complicated because you have these Indian territories all over America. Another example of racism is Arabs over Black Africans, Europeans, and Asians. A lot of people don't talk about this. But the Arabs, I don't remember the exact period of time when it was, but they had enslaved much of Europe. They enslaved Black Africans, they enslaved Europeans, they enslaved Asians, and they dominated all of these groups of people, and they proclaimed Arab superiority. It was mostly related to the Muslim religion, but this particular movement ended up, they say, killing somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 million people and enslaving people. If you go back in history and you look at the Barbary Coast, you'll find where a lot of this activity happened. So Arab Muslims have enslaved and killed millions of Europeans. Europeans have enslaved and killed millions of Africans, and so on. Asians. There's no group of people that's exempt from racism. That's the very, very important thing. I had an interesting experience when I went to Ireland a few years ago. And when I went to Ireland and Scotland, the Irish said to me, they said, well, the British are racist against us. And so you have both white races, but the British treated the Irish almost like they treated black people, or Indians, or people who were slaves. And in fact, they enslaved some of them and treated them poorly. In Brazil, there's the same thing. When Africans were transported to Brazil, right now in much of Latin America and South America, there's a racism that exists where the black people are on the lower end of the totem pole, the lighter skin is higher. And then, so you have all of these variations of racism. So racism is everywhere. Let me give you some other examples. Some people unfortunately have the notion in their head that black people can't be racist, but black people can be just as racist as white people. It just happens that black people are on the bottom end and the receiving end, the brunt of a lot of racism, so it's magnified. But you have racism and prejudice among black people. I remember not growing up, but I went to college in North Florida, and my black friends, we would sit down and talk, and we would talk about these crackers and these hunkies and so on. And then among my black friends, there was racism and prejudice based upon your skin color. So for example, I'm a light-skinned black person. So, some people, they would say, okay, you are yellow, and the people would, talk about you derogatorily. And so that's another level of racism if you use it from a broad spectrum of racism. The funny thing about it is, in my family, like many Americans, like many persons of African descent in the Caribbean, you can have one family with extreme color variations. So I have brothers who are much darker than me, and people would think, well, this can't be your brother with both parents. But the truth of the matter is, both parents, and we are just different shades. So there's black racism also, and some black people are racist. Some black people have taken on the same perspective of the white ideologues and determined that being black is superior. When you think about it, your skin color is derived from something called melanin. Melanin has no character, melanin has no personality. So melanin has nothing to do with who's superior or who's not superior. Melanin is just an inanimate thing. So your skin color is basically irrelevant. Now I want to tell you something that's powerful that I want you to remember about skin color. The thing about skin color is it does not make sense to try to elevate a skin color, because none of us are responsible for our skin color. You had nothing to do, absolutely nothing to do with your skin color. So the best thing to do is embrace who you are and realize that, okay, I was born black, or if you were born white, or whatever it is, you just have to embrace who you are, because you can't change it. You were not responsible for being black, so just embrace it. And you celebrate your heritage, but you don't try to elevate who you are based upon your skin color, because if you are elevating something that you had nothing to do with, it's kind of a futile exercise. It doesn't make sense. Okay? Now, before I depart from the historical examples of racism, let's go a little bit further. So you also had racism in New Zealand with the native population and the white population, in Mexico with the Mayans, southern Mexico, Central America, the Greeks, the Romans. All of these cultures had variations of racism based upon skin color or other traits, sometimes facial features, all kinds of things. I mean, you name it, it was there. The Japanese and Chinese, so the Japanese were racist against the Chinese and the Koreans. The Japanese proclaimed their superiority. In fact, in World War II, they aligned with Hitler, and they proclaimed their superiority. So these are all examples of racism. Racism is also tied to something called eugenics, where you try to eliminate populations that you deem inferior. And that's another very important topic that we need to look at in another context. So that's a little bit about racism. As I conclude that, remember this. From the 1500 to 1650, when transatlantic slaving was still in its infancy, more white Christian slaves were probably taken to Barbary than black African slaves to the Americas Algerians in the Mediterranean and Atlantic just between 1785 and 1793 also enslaved Europeans and so on. So that's just another example. And that's from the book by Ronald Siegel. It's called Islam's Black Slaves. It estimates that the total number of African slaves shipped to the Muslim world somewhere between 15 million and 14 million. This breaks down as follows. It comes up to somewhere in the neighborhood of 19 million deaths. And of course, this data is spotty, so it's difficult to determine exactly how many people were killed and not killed. So the truth of the matter is, all races, white people, Africans, Arabians, Europeans, all enslaved, promoted racism, and killed people. Even within Africa, there's racism. Sometimes it's manifest in what we call tribalism. And you had, some of us, we remember the Rwandan genocide and so on. So all of these things, even if they are not tied specifically to racism, they are kind of bonded to the racist ideology where one tribe is superior than another tribe, one skin color is superior than another. Okay? So, now let's talk about how to solve racism, because it exists. It will exist and it will always exist. But over time, it's been proven that changes happen. People become enlightened, people change their minds, people become wiser, and they realize that this racist ideology does not make sense. There's no scientific data to back it up. Every time people try to promulgate it, it keeps getting defeated. I remember, in the late 70s, early 80s, when I was in America going to college and beyond, I remember running into a lot of white people who were pushing the idea that white people were smarter. Well, the problem with that was that many of the universities, the Asians who came in from India and China and other places, and the Africans who came in from Nigeria and other countries, were dominating in certain fields, especially mathematics and science. And so, the whole theory that white people were smarter was being debunked in the very universities where some white people were trying to propagate it. Okay? So, America has a lot of misconceptions. America thinks that the land of America belongs to white people, but the truth of the matter is, it never belonged to white people. White people from England, from the United Kingdom, came to America and formed a colony or an extension of Britain. And later on, they revolted against Britain and declared independence, and then took over the land from the Indians, fought the Indians, negotiated treaties, gave them rum, all kinds of things, all kinds of briberies and so on. If you go to the Indian Museum, I remember I went to the Indian Museum in Indiana, and there are several all over the United States, and you look it up historically, and you'll find that there have been some major atrocities when it comes to the British population, or what we call American, who really devastated the Indian population. Okay, so now, how do we solve racism? If we want to solve racism, there are several things that we have to do. The first thing is you have to embrace your heritage, but not worship your heritage. If you're black, you can say, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. If you're white, you can say, hey, I'm thankful to be white. If you're Asian, thankful to be Asian, Chinese. So you can embrace your heritage, but you don't want to worship your heritage, because your heritage is simply a distinction, and it's nothing special. We all are special in our own way, and we can celebrate our uniqueness, but not try to elevate our uniqueness and make us better than another group. So embrace your heritage, but do not worship your heritage. Racism comes when you start to worship who you are and elevate your value beyond what you really are. Elevate your value among others. I look in the book of Genesis, and it says, God told man to have dominion. And he said, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and so on. He never said to have dominion over human beings. So we're not supposed to dominate each other. We're supposed to elevate each other. We're supposed to dominate the animals, the birds, and so on, the fishes, but we are not to dominate each other. Remember what I said earlier. You had nothing to do with where you were born, and you had nothing to do with your skin color. So don't get prideful about your skin color. Embrace it, celebrate it, but don't try to make it something more important than it is. And don't try to overcompensate no matter what race or ethnicity you have. You know, one of the problems that we have sometimes is that people are trying to find white demons. You know, they're saying, okay, they are white demons. There's no such thing as a white demon because a skin color doesn't have a demon. What they are referring to is white people who have embraced this ideology and are perpetrating it. When you think about it, every time that black people made an advancement in America, there were millions of white people who were fighting with them. So if the skin color makes you evil, then how is it that all of these people who are supposed to be evil have all of a sudden become good? It's because it had nothing to do with the skin color. It had something to do with the ideology. And once their ideology is refreshed and their thinking is clarified, then people realize, okay, this does not make sense. So now what we have in America with all of the protests is we have black people and white people walking together, simply saying, hey, racism doesn't make sense. Let's get over it, let's move on. So don't try to find a white demon under every rock. And the other thing too is, one of the mistakes that black people make and other people of color make sometimes is you end up alienating the people who are trying to fight for you. So we have thousands of white people who are protesting in the street, some of them genuinely, some of them, you know, off base, but there are many genuine white protesters. And there are many genuine white people who don't believe in racism and who believe in equality and who are fighting for it. So don't offend the people who are helping you. Learn to embrace those who are helping you. First of all, you have to defeat racism in your own mind. If you're a black person, you have to get rid of the notion that there is a superior race of any kind. You have to begin with the notion that, look, we are all equal. God made us all the same. Then no one is superior. And the problem that you begin fighting is ideology instead of skin color. When you fight ideology, you can change a person's thinking. You can't change their skin color. If a person's skin color makes them racist, then that means that they can never become unracist or anti-racist. So it's not about skin color, it's about changing the ideology. The next thing I want you to remember is, in the same way, if we want to defeat racism, we have to be careful about demonizing policemen, because again, it's the same thing. If you're a policeman, it doesn't make you racist. There may be a racist ideology that has circulated in some police circles, and so some policemen have adopted this racist ideology and it's reflected in their behavior. There are other policemen who are not that way. So if we profile the police and we say, policemen, and we say all police are racist and all police are thugs and all pigs are rotten, then what we do is we do the same thing that we say that we don't want people to do to us. We don't want to be profiled for being black. Well, why are you profiling the police? And I think it's very important in your anger and whatever you see happen, that we not try to make people guilty or innocent by reason of color or badge. So for example, if a policeman shoots a black man, we shouldn't automatically assume that the policeman was evil and he intentionally did it and he ought to go to jail. What you do is you allow the facts to dictate it. One of the things that I said in my last session was that it's so important to make sure that you use the tools available. So if there is a camera that can tell the story, then we can find out exactly what happened. Let it go to a grand jury, let it go to public opinion. If it goes on social media, let people look at it and make an interpretation. But don't automatically assume guilt or innocence. In the case of George Floyd, it was clear, very, very clear. Other cases are not so clear. So we can't just take every case and say every time a white police officer assaults or I shouldn't say assaults, but harms a black person, that they are automatically wrong. We need to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and allow it to play its course. If we don't do that, then what ends up happening is we become crowd jurists. So the crowd determines who is guilty or innocent, and there's no process of justice. Without the process of justice, it's no different than the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, once they heard something happen regarding a black person, they became the jury, and so they said, guilty, let's lynch them. Okay, so we can't have modern day lynching on any side. We have to use the justice system to make determinations of guilt or innocence. Also, remember, melanin is neutral. Your ideology comes from your brain and your spirit. So what we have to do is we have to focus in on developing our morals, our character, developing spiritually, adopting principles that elevate us. What are some of those principles? From my perspective, a part of one of the things that changed my life was me adopting the Christian philosophy of life. Me becoming a born again Christian, and that changed my life. It changed my perspective. It changed my behavior. I went from being a very hateful person. Some persons may have considered me a criminal. I did all kinds of things. If you don't know the story, you can read it in my book. Look me up. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. But I have a history. I come from the streets, been through a lot of stuff. But when my mind was changed, when I was changed spiritually, then it impacted my behavior. Jesus made a statement. He said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." So if we can learn to embrace these things spiritually, it changes our behavior. So character development, spiritual influence are very, very important in changing racist ideology, criminal ideology, any negative behavior. It all begins with our embracing what God has provided for us. So now let's get into some specifics about how to solve racism. Okay, so if you want to solve racism, there are several things that need to happen. One of the things that we have to be consciously aware of right now is that the protests are important. There's nothing wrong with protests. Martin Luther King was a protester. Malcolm X was a protester. All of these protests are very important because it brings to light injustices. But every protest needs to transform into a movement that has specific goals, because if you just protest indefinitely, nothing changes. You just make a lot of noise, people get irritated with you after a while because you keep protesting. And one of the things that we need to consider when we are protesting is looking at the next phase. Let me give you an example. I have a friend of mine who's a Bahamian. He went to college in the United States, and he ended up getting a job at a major defense contractor because of what is called affirmative action. Now, what is affirmative action? Affirmative action is where the white population, recognizing that the black population was disenfranchised, they created a program where black college students can get preferential treatment on jobs because they were denied so much in the past. So it's a matter of righting past wrongs. It's kind of a form of reparations, and I'm going to get into reparations in a while. But we have to understand that once you get beyond the demonstrations, we have to communicate what are the goals, what do we want to achieve, and how do we get to that destiny. So there needs to be a plan. Let me tell you something else that's very, very important for black protesters and the black population to get in mind right now. Opportunities are going to come out of this. And so you have to be ready for the opportunities. Affirmative action provided some opportunities, and with the white population realizing the level of disenfranchisement, the level of poverty, the level of struggle of black people, if it is coming more to the front, what's going to happen now is legislation is going to be passed mandating more opportunities. But if you're not prepared for the opportunities, it'll be a wasted exercise. So the black population now needs to start looking at creating black entrepreneurs, getting more black persons to go to college, increasing the level of education. It's one thing to complain, it's another thing to prepare. If you want to succeed, you got to prepare. And so preparation needs to take place now to get the black population in a position where you can take advantage of opportunities. So make that a major key. Be prepared for the opportunities. When legislation changes, minority businesses are going to have more opportunities. Black people are going to have more opportunities on places like Wall Street. I happen to have a relative who's black, of course, and who is in a pretty high position on Wall Street. And he indicated to me that the Wall Street companies are talking about diversity. They're talking about making sure that there are a certain amount of black people on Wall Street. The problem is that the system right now kind of prevents black people from being on Wall Street, and then black people are not being prepared for Wall Street. So you have to prepare. And this relative of mine, what he did was he started a program where he took kids from the inner city and exposed them to Wall Street, took them on Wall Street, exposed them to Wall Street. So he's preparing them mentally for the opportunities to come, and that's what we have to do. Now let's talk a little bit about reparations. I believe reparations are important, but not reparations in the form of cash. Now why do I say that? If you just give people money, you haven't changed their situation. And what could happen, and probably will happen, is if you have people who are unprepared for life, who are unskilled, and you give them money, what happens is they will consume all of the money they have, and then they'll be back in the same position. So when I think about reparations, reparations should be in the form of, let's say, free education, let's say free health care, free housing, things that give people the things that they are going to work for anyhow, but it allows them to focus in on opportunities instead of survival. Food, clothing, and shelter, that's survival. If you have your food, clothing, and shelter sorted out, then you can start looking at opportunities for self-actualization. So I think it's very, very important to have reparations, but reparations should be based upon a formula that elevates black people in America. And without that, what you're going to have is you're going to have a money dump, and then the money is going to end up right back in the hands of the people who dumped it, because people will be consumers and they'll just keep consuming, buying rims and cars and all those kinds of things. I'm not saying every black person is going to do that, but history has taught us that that is what happens. A lot of people do that. So reparations and affirmative action in the form of healthcare, education, land, business opportunities, farming opportunities, whatever kind of opportunities there are, including digital, in the digital arena, digital opportunities, because the world has gone digital. So there needs to be a focus in the black community. There needs to be preparation in the black community for digital opportunities. So when legislation passes, when opportunities open up, and black people are able to take advantage of it. I mentioned my friend who ended up getting a job with a major defense contractor because of affirmative action. Today, he is a major business owner. He employs, 100 and something people. He has a massive business, but it all began because of an opportunity that came out of a protest. Okay? So now, let's talk about some other ways of solving racism. Another aspect of solving racism is removal of barriers. What do I mean by removal of barriers? Laws. There are laws and there are systems in place that inhibit the forward movement of black people. And so those laws need to be removed, they need to be amended, some people talked about amending some of the laws in the police department. So for example, I saw where laws were already passed, eliminating the neck choke holds as a form of restraint for policing. Okay, so we are removing some of the barriers. We need to identify the other barriers and remove them so that the law becomes more friendly to the black population. So we have to do a lot of correcting. I remember when I first went to school in America, coming from the Bahamas, we experienced racism, we experienced everything that America experienced, but the difference here was that the majority of the population was black. So when we gained our independence, black people gained control, not totally, but for the most part. So you had a black bank manager, you had a black prime minister, and so on. And I remember when I went to America to school, some of my black friends, when they ended up coming to the Bahamas, they would say things like, man, I want to move to the Bahamas. I've never seen a black bank manager. I've never seen a black prime minister. There's no black president. Well, now we know in America there has been a black president. So over time, corrections need to be made because the black population has started so far behind. When you were oppressed, when you were brought here as slaves, when you were dumped into the most poverty-stricken, abrasive conditions, then there has to be some form of equalizing that process. We can't just forget it. We can't just forget it and say we are equal, because we are obviously not equal. So there needs to be some correction. And the white population needs to understand and acknowledge that, okay, my family, the people who I descended from, actually were British people who came to America, who were not invited, who took over the land, ran out the Indians, brought in African slaves, and became wealthy and are enjoying a tremendous level of prosperity, in part because of what they did to the Indians and to the Americans. So there needs to be some form of reparation or correction. America still owes Indians a lot because they took Indian lands, they did all kinds of negative things to Indians. So in both cases, reparations and correction is necessary. The problem with the United Kingdom, or the Kingdom of England, Britain, whatever we want to call it, is that kingdoms are supposed to be benevolent. So a kingdom is supposed to take care of its citizens. So if a kingdom expands to a colony, the people in that colony are supposed to benefit from the kingdom, not be harmed by the kingdom. What the British did, and what many of the European colonialists did, and even the African Arab colonialists did, what a lot of colonialists did is that they colonized the world and then they extracted the wealth and they actually harmed the people. So the people in the colonies that they took over actually became worse off. I was in South Africa and it's just amazing. I mean, it's unbelievable what the Dutch, the British, and other Europeans did to the Africans in South Africa. It is unbelievable. And corrections have had to be made. We know that Nelson Mandela was leading the charge for corrections, and eventually corrections were made. There's still a long way to go, but at least there's acknowledgement and there's some form of change that's happening. And the same thing needs to happen in America. And so the next step is that there has to be strategies and laws. But let me just divert for a minute and let's talk about the role of the church in this process. The church is in a unique position because the philosophy of Jesus, God's stated philosophy for the world, is equality, is treating everyone as a brother. If we look through the words of Jesus, you have stories like the Good Samaritan, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So it tells us what kind of mentality God wants us to have. And so the church is supposed to lead the way. So the church is supposed to lead the way in eliminating racism, creating opportunities, providing whatever is needed for racial reconciliation. The church needs to be in the lead, because if the church is not in the lead, it's not adhering to what God said, what Jesus said, what the Bible said. It is very clear. It's very abundantly clear. All you have to do is listen to the parables and the sayings of Jesus, and you get it. The story of the Good Samaritan. He said, "Do this, and if you do this unto the least of these, you've done unto me." So God is interested in elevating the least. In fact, God doesn't believe in people suffering. And one of the things that I believe is very, very important, not only in America but worldwide, is that there should be no such thing as homelessness. So the government should provide housing for anyone who does not have housing, and wherever money has to come from to do that, that should be a right. Healthcare should be a right. It shouldn't be, you die because you don't have money. Okay, so these are things that I believe the church can play a major role in espousing and leading the way in. So the church is very important. And I know in our church we lead the way whenever there's a hurricane, and many churches lead the way. Many churches, whenever there are problems in the community, sometimes people bash the church unnecessarily and unjustly, while the church is going out there and doing so many positive things, providing hope, providing supplies, feeding the poor, working with the sick, and so on. In fact, many of our colleges, universities, hospitals came from churches. So we have to put ourselves in a position where we do all of these things to make sure that we enhance the future and we are prepared for the future. I want to wrap up with some further thoughts. One of the things that I think is very, very important for you to remember in solving racism is the whole area of productivity. One of the worst things that can ever happen to a people is for people to be idle. We need to make sure that even if you are unemployed, you are engaged in some form of work or some form of building a skill. To sit on the corner and smoke dope all day and drink all day is counterproductive to your future. So one of the most important things that we can do as a people, black people, is become productive. I know people may say, well, we don't have jobs in our community, we don't have businesses. Well, start a business. Start working on it now. You'll be surprised at what can happen if you simply become productive. God is a God of productivity. He expects us. The parable of the talents tells us that whatever you have, God expects you to develop it. He expects you, the Bible says, be fruitful and multiply. So that means whatever you have, be fruitful with it, multiply it. Okay? So we have to be productive and we have to focus in on education. Knowledge is very important. Decide not to be stupid. Decide not to be ignorant, because ignorance is one of the greatest killers. Now, let's talk a little bit about some practical examples. Some people may say to me, they may say, well, Pastor Dave, man, what you know about these things? What experience do you have? How have you seen what you are talking about bring fruit? I'm just going to give you some quick examples. One of the things that I did for many years is I worked with gang members. I went on the streets. I went in the hoods. And I witnessed the young people. I played basketball with them. I brought them out. And it culminated, my outreach to young people in the ghettos culminated in a program where myself and another young man here in the Bahamas who was a former gang leader and a former criminal and so on. Both of us came from similar backgrounds. We got together and we launched something called Peace on the Streets. And so we went out and reached out to young men who were troubled. Even before we did the Peace on the Street thing, I went into schools and I said to the principals, give me the worst boys. I'm going to work with them. And I worked with gang members and I saw their lives transform. And let me give you an example. So there's one young man, let's call him LL. LL was in a gang from the time he was about 11 or 12. He lived on the streets. He didn't have a home. He was homeless. He didn't know who his father was. His mother was insane. But through mentoring, through life coaching, through him being involved in the ministry that I was involved in, his life was changed. When he gave his life to Christ, when he came into the mentoring program, and one of the things that I did with all of these young men who I worked with who came from gang-oriented backgrounds is I didn't tell them to just, okay, go to church and be good. I taught them how to be productive. So this young man started out by developing his own car wash. And today he's a businessman. He's a husband, he's a father, he's a recording artist, he has his own buildings and property. And so it tells you can come from nothing and you can make something of yourself. Another example is a man that I call SL. So SL was another gangbanger. One time he went into a church, pulled a gun on the people, took all of their purses and jewelry. And this is another young man who came into a relationship with Christ through the ministry that I was involved in. And today he's a husband, he's a father. He never finished high school, but he went on the internet and he learned how to do mastering of music to the point where he owns his own studio. He's a businessman, he owns his own buildings, a husband, a father, and a great example. Another example is another young man, I'll call him MM. So MM was a local DJ. He used to DJ for gang members, he used to DJ at parties and so on. But this is another young man. He came to Christ, he came into my mentoring program, and when he came into my mentoring program, he ended up developing. I encouraged him, and I did, with all of these guys, I did entrepreneurship sessions. I taught them how to succeed in business because I was a businessman. I was in business all my life. In the early days, from the age of 13, I used to buy low and sell high. But I took my business acumen and I started into legitimate business. I had a computer company. Well, I still have a computer company. I had a clothing company. I had a lawn care company. And so I did the things that I'm talking about. And I didn't have a lot of money. I started broke. I was so broke at the end of the day, we hardly had food. And this is after graduating from college. But I used my productivity, I used my ingenuity, and I used my entrepreneurship skills, and I built my own companies. And the last one I want to mention is a guy called Six. So Six was from the streets, from one of the neighborhoods that I grew up in where I used to run around with. And, he came out of this neighborhood. Again, he came into our mentorship program. He came into a relationship with Christ. His life was changed. And today, he's a husband, father, businessman. How is it that all of these young men who were written off by society, who people concluded could never make it, how can all these men become entrepreneurs? They can become husbands and fathers, pillars in their community. The last guy that I mentioned, he's a pastor. How can these people be transformed? They were transformed when we understood that your mind and your heart is more important than your skin color. And you have to focus in on developing your gifts, your talents, your abilities. I use a terminology when I work with young men. I call it PMF. Pursue your purpose, maximize your potential, and fulfill your destiny. So we have to focus in on opportunities. I want you to know today that the internet is a massive equalizer. Years ago, you had to have a certain amount of capital, you had to have all kinds of things to be successful in business. Now, all you need is a computer, and you can equalize a lot of inequities from the past. Right now, you can develop a YouTube channel, and there are many YouTube sensations who uploaded videos on YouTube, and they became business people because YouTube pays you. So we have to teach young black people how to equalize the environment through digital technology, because it's possible. There are opportunities available. We have to prepare for the opportunities. After you protest, after legislation changes, after progress is made, you got to be prepared for the opportunities. If you're not prepared for the opportunities, it's going to be more of the same. So we have to prepare. And remember, focus in on character. You don't want to descend to the lowest denominator. You want to make sure that you elevate your life, you elevate your game, and you take yourself higher. In my case, I believe through God, because I believe God made us, He gave us a purpose, He gave us potential. So if we pursue our purpose in God, if we maximize our potential in God, then the sky is the limit. There's so many things that we can do. But racism is an ideology. It's not a skin color. And the ideology has already been debunked. So we have to make sure that it's defeated, and as it's defeated, that equalization takes place. Legislation compensates for what has happened to black people. Black people have been the victims of racism. In another country, it may be white people. In another country, it may be Asians. But whoever it is, that equalization needs to take place. So once again, thank you for your time. This is my contribution to the issue of racism, and this has been part 2, understanding and solving racism and defeating racism. So continue to stay tuned for more to come, and feel free to comment, feel free to like, share, subscribe, and this is Dave Burrows, and I'm here to give you wisdom and to give you knowledge to take you higher.